Welcome to Study Hall Art Explored. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on an image that feels instantly familiar, even if you can't quite pinpoint why. Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus.
It really does have that kind of power, doesn't it? It's just sort of embedded in our visual culture.
Absolutely. And thanks to this great stack of sources you've shared with us, articles, research, your notes, we're going to take a real deep dive.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Think of this as your ultimate shortcut to understanding this masterpiece, where it came from, the world it was created in, and exactly why it still pops up everywhere today. From high art reinterpretations to, well, we'll definitely get to that.
Right. Our mission, really, is to explore who Botticelli was, the incredible vibrancy of Renaissance Florence during his time,
Yeah.
the likely patrons behind this specific piece,
Yeah.
and then really get into the painting itself, kind of decoding the figures, the symbols, and all those layers of meaning packed into it.
We're also going to look at how this painting was kind of revolutionary for its day, pushing boundaries and challenging norms.
And yes, just for you, we absolutely have to talk about its fascinating and sometimes pretty surprising journey through modern pop culture.
All right, let's open up these sources and unpack this. Where do we even begin with understanding the birth of Venus? Maybe with the artist himself.
That seems like a great place to start, yeah. The man behind the brush was Sandro Botticelli, born Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippi in Florence, sometime between 1444 and 1446.
Okay.
He lived until 1510, becoming a truly leading figure in Italian art during that period we call the early Renaissance, or the Quattrocento.
So, right in the thick of that explosive time for art in Italy, how did he get started? What was his training like?
Interestingly, he began not as a painter, but as a goldsmith, which is pretty demanding work.
Right, precision work.
Exactly. You wonder if that early experience influenced his meticulous lines later on. But he then apprenticed under Fra Filippo Lippi, who was, well, one of the most prominent Florentine painters of the era.
Ah, so he learned from the best. What kind of things did Lippi teach him?
Well, Lippi was known for his graceful lines, a really delicate way of modeling flesh, giving it that soft, luminous quality, and a really sensitive approach to portraying feminine beauty. You can definitely see echoes of Lippi's style in Botticelli's mature work, particularly in the figure's elegant poses and expressions.
He must have absorbed it quickly because he opened his own workshop relatively early, right? Around 1470?
Yeah, about then. And that's when his distinct style really coalesced those flowing lines, the figures that feel almost weightless, that intense focus on the human form, but rendered with an almost ethereal quality.
And that unique style quickly caught the attention of the wealthiest families in Florence.
Oh, absolutely. He became incredibly well patronized, most notably by the incredible, powerful Medici family.
The Medici. You can't talk about Renaissance Florence without mentioning them. They basically bankrolled the era, didn't they?
Pretty much, yeah.
Did Botticelli work for them exclusively?
Not entirely. He even received a prestigious commission from Pope Sixtus V to work on frescoes in the Sistine Chapel in Rome in 1481. That was a big deal.
Wow, okay.
But after returning to Florence, there's a noticeable shift in his focus. He began painting more secular and mythological subjects alongside his ongoing religious commissions. And that's precisely the context from which The Birth of Venus emerges.
Okay, so that shift is key. Let's get to the painting itself then, the fundamental facts.
Right. So we're talking about The Birth of Venus, Nascita di Venere in Italian. Most scholars estimate it was painted around 1484 to 1486, placing it squarely in the mid-1480s.
And it depicts, well, Venus arriving, pretty clearly.
Precisely. It shows the goddess Venus arriving at the shore, having just emerged from the sea fully formed. It's a scene often referred to as Venus Anadyomene in classical art, Venus rising from the sea.
And if you want to see this iconic image today, where do you go?
You'll find it in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy, where it hangs today. It's often displayed near and discussed in relation to another of Botticelli's major mythological works, Primavera.
They feel like companions, don't they? Even if they aren't technically a pair.
They really do. They were painted for the same Medici villa. They're both in the Uffizi now, and they share thematic connections, focusing on classical figures and themes.
Right.
They also share stylistic traits, the soft colors, Botticelli's signature linear approach, even the careful, almost botanical accuracy in depicting plants. But yes, The Birth of Venus is generally the more globally recognized of the two.
Oh, what was it about this painting that would have made it stand out so dramatically in its time? What was so unprecedented about it?
There are a couple of major points. First, it's the scale. It's a large painting, and the subject is classical mythology, not religious.
Which was unusual for that size.
Very. Large-scale mythological subjects like this were pretty much unseen in post-classical Western art. But the biggest thing, I think, has to be the central figure. A large, prominent, nude female figure.
Ah, right.
Before this, large-scale nudes in Western art were almost exclusively reserved for biblical contexts, like Adam and Eve's, and often carried associations of sin or shame. Here, Venus is presented as a figure of idealized beauty. That was, well, that was radical.
That really puts it into perspective. So let's zoom out a little. You mentioned Florence and the Renaissance. What was that world like? How did this kind of art even become possible?
Well, the 1400s in Italy, especially Florence, were a time of incredible intellectual and cultural ferment, just buzzing. Florence was really the engine of the early Renaissance before the focus shifted more decisively to Rome later on.
And art was changing dramatically.
Yeah, artistically, it was a period of moving away from the more stylized, two-dimensional symbolic art of the Byzantine tradition that had dominated for centuries.
And moving towards.
A greater emphasis on naturalism, on depicting figures in space in a more lifelike, three-dimensional way. Artists like Jimmy Boo and Giotto had started this process much earlier, but the Renaissance really embraced it fully.
And who was fueling this whole explosion of creativity, paying for it all?
The wealthy families were absolutely crucial. Their patronage was the lifeblood of the arts. And again, the Medici stand out as the most significant patrons, thanks to their immense wealth from banking. They didn't just buy art. They actively fostered an intellectual environment. They were creating a culture.
Which brings us to humanism, right?
Yes, exactly. The humanist movement was central to this period. It was a rediscovery and intense study of classical Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and mythology. Scholars weren't just confined to religious texts anymore. They were openly exploring a much broader range of knowledge and ideas. It was a huge opening up.
And then there's Neoplatonism, which sounds complicated.
It was a philosophical current that was particularly influential in Florence, especially within the Medici circle. It was based on Plato's ideas, but sought to kind of integrate classical thought with Christian theology.
How did they do that?
Well, it offered a way to see pagan myths and figures, like Venus, not just as pagan deities, but as allegories or pathways to understanding Christian or divine concepts like beauty, love, and the soul's journey towards the divine.
Okay, so you have this artist trained in precision, working in a city bursting with wealth, new ideas, and a rediscovery of classical knowledge. It seems like the perfect storm for the birth of Venus. But who exactly commissioned it? Is that known for sure?
That's a great question, and it's actually a bit debated because we don't have a surviving commission contract, which is frustrating. But the evidence points very strongly to a Medici patron. The earliest historical mention we have is from the Renaissance historian Giorgio Vasari, who saw it at the Medici Villa di Castello alongside Primavera.
And that villa belonged to a junior branch of the family.
Correct. It was associated with Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de Medici, who was a cousin of the more famous Lorenzo the Magnificent.
Yeah.
For a long time, the consensus was that Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco commissioned it, possibly under the influence or guidance of Lorenzo the Magnificent, maybe even as a gift for a wedding.
But there's a question mark there.
A slight one. An inventory of Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco's property from 1499 doesn't explicitly list the birth of Venus, which has led some scholars to suggest it might have come into the family's possession a bit later, or maybe belonged to a different family member initially before ending up at the villa. The precise commissioning details are still a bit fuzzy.
Fascinating. But even with that debate, the fact that it ended up at a major Medici estate still screams Medici patronage, right? I mean, that seems pretty clear.
Oh, absolutely. That link is undeniable.
Yeah.
And that Medici connection was absolutely fundamental to the painting's existence.
How so? Was it just the money? Or more than that?
Much more than that. Their patronage provided the entire ecosystem. The financial means, yes, obviously, but also the intellectual and social environment. It gave Botticelli the freedom and the opportunity to paint a large-scale mythological subject and, crucially, a nude pagan goddess for a private space like a villa.
Right, you couldn't just hang that anywhere.
Exactly. You simply couldn't hang something like this in a church or a public building at the time. The private setting enabled this bold subject matter.
And the ideas swirling around their court helped too.
Precisely. The Medici court was steeped in humanism and Neoplatonism. This provided the crucial intellectual context for the subject matter and allowed for those deeper layers of meaning we were just talking about. Their court wasn't just about power. It was a hub of intellectual activity, poetry, philosophy.
I read that their court poet might have even been involved directly, Poliziano.
There's a strong suggestion of that, yeah. Agnolo Poliziano, the famous Medici court poet, wrote a poem called Stanzi per la Giostra that describes Venus's birth in a way that resonates really strongly with Botticelli's painting.
So he might have described the scene.
Many art historians believe Poliziano may have actually suggested the specific iconography or scene directly to Botticelli. It's a really direct line between the humanist literary scene and the actual creation of the artwork.
That's incredible to think about the poet giving notes to the painter. And there are even subtle hints in the painting that point back to the Medici, like little Easter eggs.
There are indeed. Look closely at the trees on the right. Those are orange trees. The orange was an emblem of the Medici family, a visual pun, some say, as their name might derive from mala medica, or orange medicinal apple.
Clever.
And the laurel wreath worn by the figure on the right, the Hora of Spring, might also be a direct visual reference to Lorenzo de' Medici himself, whose name, Lorenzo, is associated with the laurel.
The laurel. So they're literally weaving in their family brand. Amazing. And what about the idea that Venus herself was modeled on a real person? A famous beauty.
That's a persistent idea, yeah, suggested in some sources. It's thought that Venus might have been modeled on Simonetta Cattaneo Vespucci, who was renowned as one of the great beauties of Florence and was very much admired within the Medici circle.
Vespucci, as in the explorer Amerigo Vespucci's family.
That's the family, yes. Simonetta was married to a cousin of Amerigo. If she was indeed the model, it would add another layer of potential significance or, flattery.
Right.
Connecting the divine beauty of Venus to a real woman celebrated by prominent figures in the Medici court, like Lorenzo or his brother Giuliano, it really highlights how these grand mythological paintings could also have these personal contemporary connections baked in.
Okay, so we know the artist, the era, the likely patrons, the intellectual world. Let's really break down the scene itself. When we look at the birth of Venus, who and what are we actually seeing?
Right, let's walk through it. Starting on the left side, as we face the painting, you see two figures in the air, blowing towards Venus. These are representations of the winds.
The wind gods, like Zephyr.
Yes, exactly. Specifically Zephyr, the Greek god of the west wind, the gentle, life-giving wind often associated with spring. And his companion, entwined with him, is usually identified as either Aura, the personification of a breeze, or perhaps Chloris, a nymph associated with flowers in spring, and in some myths, Zephyr's wife.
And you can see the wind.
Yeah, Botticelli used these delicate, almost invisible lines coming from their mouths to show the wind blowing towards Venus, pushing her along.
And they're bringing her towards the shore on that giant shell.
Exactly. They provide the dynamic force. Then, on the other side of Venus, on the shore, you see a female figure waiting to receive her. This is one of the Horai, the goddesses of the seasons in Greek myth.
And she's spring.
Given the abundance of flowers on her dress, cornflowers, primroses, roses, and the pink flower-embroidered cloak she's holding out to cover Venus, she's identified as the Hora of Spring.
She looks like she's barely touching the ground, almost floating.
That's really characteristic of Botticelli's style in these mythological works. The figures often have this ethereal, almost weightless quality, which contrasts interestingly with some of the more firmly grounded landscape elements like the trees.
And what about the sources for this specific grouping and scene? Where did Botticelli get the visual blueprint? Was it just the poem you mentioned?
Well, he drew heavily on classical literary sources that were being actively studied by the humanists at the time. Works like Ovid's Metamorphoses and the Homeric hymns definitely describe Venus's birth.
Okay.
But as we discussed, that contemporary poem by Poliziano was likely a very direct source, possibly even providing the specific narrative arrangement, the specific characters involved in this moment.
So a mix of ancient texts and contemporary poetry informing the visual scene. Beyond the main figures, what about the specific objects and plants? What kind of meaning is embedded there?
Loads. The giant scallop shell Venus is standing on is incredibly symbolic. Across different cultures, it's a symbol of birth, fertility, and femininity.
Yeah.
In pagan contexts, it can clearly refer to female sexuality.
But it has other meanings, too.
Yes, it also has Christian associations. The scallop shell is linked to pilgrimage, especially the Camino de Santiago, and also to baptism. It has even been used as a symbol for the Virgin Mary.
Wow. Again, that blending of pagan and Christian symbolism we talked about.
Precisely. It really speaks to that Neoplatonic effort to find harmony between classical and Christian thought. Then you have the flowers everywhere.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
The sources highlight the accuracy with which Botticelli depicts them. Cornflowers, primroses, roses on the whore's dress and floating in the air, blown by the winds. Roses, especially red ones, were sacred to Venus in antiquity, symbolizing divine favor and blossoming love.
And he gilded them.
Some of them, yes. He used gilding, real gold leaf, on the centers of some of the roses, visually emphasizing that sense of divine favor or celestial origin. Gives a little shimmer.
And we've already touched on the orange trees and the laurel wreath.
Yes. Those are generally accepted as visual nods to the Medici family, linking the artwork back to its patrons through those subtle visual cues. The oranges for the family name, the laurels perhaps for Lorenzo.
Now, there's one detail in the very foreground that looks a little odd for a scene of a goddess arriving from the sea. Those reeds?
Ah, you mean the clumps of bulrushes. Good eye. These are typically freshwater plants, not something you'd really expect right on the seashore like that.
It feels out of place. Is there an explanation? Why are they there?
Well, some sources propose that their inclusion might be a sort of visual pun or even a subtle inside joke aimed at the knowledgeable Florentine viewers of the time.
An inside joke. In the birth of Venus. Okay, please tell me more. This sounds fun.
The interpretation is a bit cheeky, yeah. According to one version of the myth, Hesiod's theogony, Venus wasn't just born from sea foam. She was born from the foam that gathered around the severed genitals of the sky god Uranus,
Oh my goodness.
which his son Cronus had cut off and thrown into the sea. Pretty gruesome origin story.
Yeah, that's a bit.
So the bulrush, because of its, well, its shape, could be interpreted as a phallic symbol. Placing it prominently in the foreground could be a somewhat veiled, witty reference to that very specific and rather violent origin myth of Venus, something that the highly educated humanists in the Medici court would likely have picked up on and perhaps appreciated.
That's unexpected. And kind of brilliant. It makes the painting feel much more alive and connected to the specific intellect of its audience. It wasn't just a static image. It had these hidden layers for those in the know.
It really shows the sophistication of the intellectual environment, doesn't it? These works could be enjoyed on many levels, from pure aesthetic beauty to deep philosophical allegory, or even these slightly risque mythological references.
Speaking of levels, let's explore those layers of meaning more directly. You mentioned Neoplatonism. What's the dominant interpretation today based on that?
The Neoplatonic allegory is widely accepted as a key framework, probably the most dominant one now. Within this view, the physical beauty of Venus isn't just superficial. It's seen as a manifestation of divine beauty and divine love.
So looking at her helps you understand God.
In a way, yes. Contemplating her perfect physical beauty could elevate the viewer's soul towards understanding divine beauty, representing the birth of divine beauty or love entering the material world. This philosophical approach saw physical and spiritual love not in opposition, but as complementary parts of a larger whole, leading upwards towards the divine.
So the painting is almost like a tool for spiritual contemplation, in a sense.
That's the idea within that Neoplatonic context, yeah. It aligns perfectly with the humanist environment where such philosophical ideas were being actively debated and explored. It gave a sort of Christian justification for appreciating classical beauty.
And you mentioned a more practical purpose earlier, perhaps a wedding painting.
That's another strong possibility discussed in the sources, yeah. Wealthy Florentine families often commissioned allegorical paintings with themes of love, virtue, and procreation for the rooms, the camera of newly married couples.
Makes sense.
Venus as the goddess of love, marriage, and fertility, along with all the symbols surrounding her, the springtime setting, the flowers would be incredibly relevant and appropriate for a wedding context, offering guidance or maybe a blessing to the newlyweds.
So it could be philosophical and ceremonial, serving both purposes?
Exactly. Why not both? And it could also simply be appreciated as a beautiful, elegant depiction of a classical myth by the erudite humanists in the Medici court, a courtly mythological allegory enjoyed for its aesthetic qualities and its connections to classical literature they were all reading.
Now, there's that fascinating, slightly debated interpretation connecting it to Christianity more directly, the baptism parallel.
Right. Some scholars have proposed a reading that sees parallels between the composition of the birth of Venus and traditional depictions of the baptism of Christ.
How does that work?
Think about the visual structure. You have a central nude figure emerging from water. You have winged figures nearby like angels, and another figure waiting on the shore with something to cover them, like John the Baptist with Christ's robe.
I can definitely see the visual similarity now you pointed out.
Right. In this proposed view, Venus's emergence from the water could be seen as the baptism or beginning of her ministry of love, analogous to Christ's ministry beginning with his baptism. The scallop shell, already a symbol of baptism in Christian tradition, reinforces this possible link.
And Venus is Mary.
Some even extend this to see Venus as a kind of pagan parallel or prefiguration of the Virgin Mary, particularly Mary as Stella Maris, the star of the sea, rising for the waves to guide humanity.
Is there actual evidence Botticelli intended this Christian reading, though?
That's the key point. The sources emphasize that there's no historical documentation from Botticelli's time suggesting he explicitly intended this painting to be a Christian allegory. It's more about how viewers at the time might have interpreted it.
So it shows the mindset.
Exactly. It highlights how the intellectual environment of the Renaissance was fluid, with people actively seeking connections and parallels between classical ideas and their Christian faith. Viewers might have seen these echoes, these resonances, even if it wasn't the artist's primary stated goal.
So rather than one single lockdown meaning, the painting was likely designed, or at least understood, to be viewed and interpreted on multiple levels: philosophical, mythological, maybe political with the Medici links, and potentially even filtered through a Christian lens by some viewers.
That seems to be the most accepted view today, yeah. Its enduring power probably comes in part from its ability to resonate across these different intellectual and symbolic frameworks. It's rich.
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about the painting purely as an object, as a piece of art. What about Botticelli's technique and style here? How did he actually make it?
Well, he used tempera paint on canvas, which was actually a bit unusual in Tuscany at the time. Wooden panels were still more common for major works. Canvas was less expensive than large wood panels, which might have been a factor given the painting's considerable size. It was also maybe seen as more suitable for villas, less formal than panel.
And his style isn't exactly like the hyper-realistic art we might think of later in the Renaissance, is it? It looks different.
No, not at all. That's key to understanding Botticelli. His figures have that signature linear grace. They appear almost weightless, outlined with distinct dark lines that emphasize their form rather than strictly modeling them with light and shadow for realistic volume or weight.
He's mixing things up.
Yeah, he's consciously blending elements. Venus's modest pose, the Venus Pudica, is taken directly from classical sculpture prototypes, like the famous Medici Venus statue. But the flowing lines, the elegance, and the way the figures seem to float have echoes of earlier Gothic styles, a sort of lingering medieval sensibility.
And the gold.
Yes, he even used gilding, not just on the roses we mentioned, but on Venus's hair, giving it this luminous, almost divine, otherworldly glow. It enhances the highlights.
How does his approach compare to other major artists of the time, say Mantegna or later Titian?
It really stands out. You had artists like Mantegna in northern Italy focusing intensely on perspective, archaeological detail, and creating figures that feel like solid, almost sculptural forms carved from stone.
Very different feel.
Totally. And later, Venetian painters like Titian would paint Venuses. Think of his Venus of Urbino that were far more sensuous, reclining nudes clearly intended for private contemplation in wealthy homes, very focused on texture and flesh.
So Botticelli's is more formal.
You could say that. It's more formal, upright, focused on a clear mythological narrative. It's fundamentally defined by its elegant lines and its decorative qualities rather than realism or overt sensuality. It has a kind of cool elegance.
So it's stylistically significant too, not just groundbreaking in its subject matter. What's its place in the broader history of art? How important is it?
Oh, it's incredibly important. It was one of the very earliest large-scale European paintings of a nude pagan subject since antiquity. That decision to paint a classical myth at this size, featuring a nude goddess not as Eve but as Venus, was incredibly bold.
And only possible because of the context.
Right. It was really only feasible within the specific cultural and intellectual climate of Renaissance Florence, and crucially, enabled by that powerful Medici patronage for a private setting. And his use of canvas, while not unique, certainly foreshadowed its much wider adoption by painters later on, especially in Venice.
Did everyone appreciate it immediately and continuously, or did its fame fade?
Not quite. Botticelli's work, believe it or not, actually went out of fashion after his death and was somewhat overlooked for centuries. The high Renaissance style of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael took over.
Really? When did it come back?
He was rediscovered in the 19th century, particularly by the pre-Raphaelite artists in England, think Rossetti, Burne-Jones. They were drawn to his linear grace, his idealized beauty, the poetic and narrative depth of his work. It resonated with their own aims. That rediscovery really cemented the birth of Venus as a canonical work in the Western art historical tradition.
And today, how are people looking at it now? Still just admiring the beauty?
Modern interpretations continue to explore its complexity, absolutely. Feminist and psychoanalytic readings, for example, often examine Venus's pose, her rather ambiguous gaze or lack thereof, the idealization of the female form, and its implications within the context of the male gaze in art history.
Is there a consensus on whether it's empowering or problematic in that sense?
Not really. It's definitely debated. Some see her modest pose, the pudica gesture, as a form of agency or empowerment, a sort of quiet self-possession. Others analyze how it contributed to shaping Western ideals of female beauty and how that image has been used or challenged in contemporary discussions about beauty standards, the representation of women's bodies, and the ongoing effort to reclaim the female body in art.
So it's still making people talk.
Definitely. It's a potent cultural touchstone that continues to provoke discussion and interpretation. It's not settled history.
Which brings us to the truly wild part. Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This painting, created over 500 years ago for a private villa in Florence, is somehow absolutely everywhere in today's world. It's inescapable.
It has truly transcended its origins to become a global pop culture icon. It's amazing.
Our sources are just full of examples. I mean, Lady Gaga, seriously.
Absolutely. Remember the cover art for her 2013 album Art Pop,
Mm-hmm.
designed by Jeff Koons? It features a sort of collage, a sculpture of Gaga with a background that mashes up parts of the birth of Venus.
Yeah.
Koons explicitly stated his intention was to present Gaga as a modern Venus, symbolizing the pursuit and the enjoyment of aesthetics and of beauty in our hyper-mediated digital age.
And she leaned into it visually in her music videos too, didn't she?
Oh yeah, definitely. In the video for Applause, she directly evokes Venus, appearing in scallop shells and wearing that distinctive flowing blonde wig. And of course, she even had a song on the album explicitly titled Venus. She really ran with it.
The New Yorker has famously used it for covers too, often humorously.
They have. There's a well-known one from 1992 showing Venus arriving on the shore, but instead of zephyr and aura blowing wind, there's someone standing there holding a hairdryer.
Heh, classic.
A really witty take on modern beauty rituals. And more recent one from 2014 showed her arrival being greeted not by the horror of spring, but by a swarm of people holding up iPhones, taking pictures, a comment on the ubiquitous nature of image sharing and replication today.
Even James Bond had a Botticelli moment. Or two.
Yes. In Ian Fleming's 1958 Dr. No novel, Bond sees Honeychella Rider emerging from the sea and explicitly describes her as being like Botticelli's Venus from the back.
Ah, so it was in the book first.
Yep. And that iconic scene in the 1962 film adaptation with Ursula Andress and later Halle Berry's similar entrance in Die Another Day are direct visual homages to that idea, referencing the painting's cultural cachet, even if they flip the pose to show the front.
And it's gone way beyond magazines and movies. What about street art? Murals.
Oh yeah. Artist Rip Kronk created a series of famous murals at Venice Beach, California, notably one called Venice on the Half Shell. His Venus is totally updated. She's got roller skates, short shorts, a crop top, sunglasses.
Very Venice Beach.
Exactly. It's a way of modernizing the myth, reflecting the local culture, and as Kronk himself pointed out, his mural is probably seen by vastly more people on any given day than will ever visit the Uffizi in Florence. It brings art to the street.
Artists from completely different cultural backgrounds are engaging with it too, right? Reworking it.
Definitely. Think of the Chinese artist Yin Xian, who reworks famous Western masterpieces but gives the figures distinct Chinese characteristics. His Venus, after Botticelli, features Venus with black hair and recognizably Asian features.
What's the point
It's
there?
a powerful statement about how cultural context shapes our perception of these supposedly universal canonical works. It challenges the dominance of Western beauty standards and highlights how representation matters.
Photographer David LaChapelle also gave it a very distinct, modern, almost hyper-real twist.
Yes, his Rebirth of Venus series takes the concept and filters it through his signature high-gloss, super-saturated pop aesthetic. His Venus figures are often tanned, toned, wearing high heels and elaborate headwear set in these tropical, almost artificial-looking environments.
Still got the shell, though.
Often, yeah. The shell is still there, but sometimes made even more explicit in its symbolic reference to female anatomy. It's Botticelli's myth processed through a very contemporary, slick, and sometimes intentionally provocative lens, often emphasizing raw sexuality over ethereal beauty.
And Beyoncé, referencing it in one of the most widely seen photos ever, her pregnancy announcement.
Absolutely. Awol Arisku's portraits of Beyoncé for that announcement are a fantastic example of engaging with the classical canon in a powerful, contemporary way. Her maternity photos, with the lush flowers, the flowing fabric, directly reference Venus's pose, especially the hands covering her breasts and pregnant belly.
But there's a difference.
The crucial difference, yes. Unlike Botticelli's somewhat averted gaze Venus, Beyoncé is often looking directly, confidently at the camera. It feels like a reclaiming of the image, asserting control over her own representation and its dissemination, especially using social media to bypass traditional gatekeepers. It's a really powerful statement about Black motherhood, beauty, and agency.
Even Andy Warhol, the king of pop art, took on Venus. How did he approach it?
He did, as part of his Details of Renaissance portrait series in the mid-'80s. He took iconic images, including details of Venus's face, and manipulated them using early computer graphics tools like the Amiga computer and ProPaint software.
What did he do to them?
He cropped them, flattened the perspective, dramatically recolored them in bright, artificial palettes, sometimes even adding repeated elements like a third eye using the copy-paste tool. It's the ultimate pop art deconstruction replication, distortion, turning this revered classical image into repeatable, manipulable visual data. Very Warhol.
And for something completely different, Terry Gilliam made her dance in Monty Python.
Yes, he famously did, in his cutout animations for Monty Python's Flying Circus. He frequently made figures from classical paintings move and behave absurdly, and Botticelli's Venus was definitely one of his targets.
And in his movie Baron Munchausen, too.
That's right. In The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, Uma Thurman, playing Venus, emerges dramatically from a giant shell fountain, directly animating the painting's central image. Gilliam often talked about loving the idea of taking these static, revered images off museum walls and bringing them into popular culture, making people laugh, or maybe inspiring them to go see the original, making them accessible.
And just to add one more totally different realm again, it was even used as the splash screen image for Adobe Illustrator software for years and years.
That's right. From about 1987 to 2003, I think. So a fundamental tool for graphic designers all over the world, featured this Renaissance masterpiece every single time you open the application. It just shows how deep and incredibly varied its penetration into modern visual culture is. It's everywhere.
It's truly mind-boggling when you list it like that. How this single image, painted half a millennium ago for a specific private audience in Florence, has traveled so far and been embraced, reinterpreted, parodied, celebrated, and transformed in so many different ways. It really has cemented its status as a universal cultural icon.
It absolutely has. There are few images like it.
So what do we take away from all this? I mean, we started with just looking at a famous painting of a goddess on a shell, right? And we've gone on this incredible journey through Renaissance Florence, the incredible influence of the Medici family, the explosion of new intellectual ideas like humanism and Neoplatonism, deep philosophical concepts, witty visual puns, and even potentially subtle inside jokes understood only by a small circle back then.
And we've seen how this painting was genuinely groundbreaking for its time. It wasn't just beautiful, it was revolutionary in its subject matter and its bold depiction of the female nude in a completely new, non-biblical context.
Yeah.
It really challenged norms for how artists approached the human form and what subjects were considered worthy of monumental art.
And the fact that this one image has endured, traveling through centuries, being constantly reinterpreted, parodied, celebrated, and showing up in everything from high fashion and album covers to music videos, movie scenes, street art, and even software splash screens, it's just astounding, really.
It truly demonstrates how art from the past isn't just something static locked away in a museum. It has this dynamic, ongoing life. It continues to resonate, to inspire, and to spark creativity and conversations in our modern world, often in ways the original artist could never have imagined.
Yeah. This deep dive into the sources really shows you just how much there is to find beneath the surface, even of an image you think you know really well.
It does. It's a reminder that even the most familiar images have these hidden depths and fascinating histories just waiting to be explored. You just need to look a bit closer.
Okay, so for your final provocative thought, building on this whole deep dive, Botticelli's Venus broke major barriers by presenting a large-scale nude female form as pure beauty, pretty much devoid of the shame often associated with nudes in previous Christian art. And he did this during a time that was transitioning away from a solely or rigidly religious focus in art. So how does this specific historical moment and this specific painting's complex legacy challenge or perhaps even reinforce our modern debates about beauty standards, about the depiction of the female body in media, and about the whole concept of the gaze in contemporary art and culture?
That's a great question. Definitely something to think about next time you spot her face or her shell popping up somewhere unexpected out in the wild, which you probably will.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Botticelli's Birth of Venus.